Hello friends, today we will discuss about the biodiversity of India and our main objectives will be to understand the concept of biodiversity, to ascertain the value and importance of biodiversity, to evaluate various threat perceptions to the biodiversity, to be familiar with the perspective of Indian biodiversity and to understand the conservatory measures for the biodiversity. Friends, let me introduce you the term biodiversity. Bio means life, diversity means variety. Biodiversity is the term given to the variety of life on the earth and the natural patterns it forms. It is formally defined in Biological Diversity Act 2002 as the variability among living organisms from all sources and the ecological complexes of which they are part, and includes diversity within species or between species and of ecosystems. Biodiversity is a product of over 3.5 billion years of evolution and history. The recent interest in the biodiversity can be traced back to the Rio Earth Summit of 1992, where world leaders agreed on a comprehensive sustainable development strategy leading to the creation of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now friends, let's learn about the types of biodiversity. Biodiversity is divided into three types, and those are genetic diversity, species diversity, ecosystem diversity. Now students, we will understand these one by one. First of all, we will take genetic diversity. It is the diversity within a species. The genes found in organisms can form enormous number of combinations, each of which gives rise to some variability. When the genes within the same species show different versions due to new combinations, it is called genetic variability. For example, all rice varieties belong to the species Oryza sativa, but there are different varieties which differ in their shape, size, aroma due to variations at the genetic level. Second type of biodiversity is species biodiversity. It is the diversity between different species. The richness of species in ecosystem is called species diversity. Species biodiversity means variety of species within a region. Such diversity can be measured on the basis of species in a region. More species diversity means more biological wealth. For example, tiger, Felis tigris, cat, Felis domestica. Third type of biodiversity is ecosystem diversity. It is the diversity within a region. An ecosystem develops its own characteristic community of living organisms depending upon the availability of abiotic resources, environmental conditions and other factors. This is the diversity of ecological complexity showing variations in ecological niches, trophic structure, food webs, nutrient cycling and so on. In addition, ecosystem also shows variation with respect to physical parameters like moisture, temperature, altitude, precipitation, etc. Thus, there occurs tremendous diversity within the ecosystems along these gradients. For example, a pond possesses different sets of flora and fauna as compared to the river ecosystem. Dear students, let's move on to our next section, that is megadiversity. Megadiversity means the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within each species, between species and of ecosystems. The megadiverse countries are a group of countries that are biodiversity rich countries in the world. Of the 170 countries in the world, a mere 17 countries lay claim to 70% of the world's biodiversity. The 17 countries that lay claim to 70% of the world's biodiversity include Australia, Brazil, China, Colombia, Ecuador, the United States, South Africa, India, Indonesia, Madagascar, Malaysia, Mexico, Papua New Guinea, Peru, the Philippines, Venezuela and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. All these countries have been labeled mega diverse by the United Nations Environment Programme's World Conservation Monitoring Center, and these countries have a large responsibility to protect and conserve their diverse yet fragile ecosystems. Students, we will now talk about India as a mega diversity nation. India is one of the 17 mega diversity nations in the world, commanding 7% of the world's biodiversity. It is situated at the tri-junction of three realms: Afrotropical, Indo-Malayan and Paleo-Arctic realms, and therefore has a characteristic elements from each of them. India is remarkable in both species richness and endemism, having 11% of flora and 6.5% of fauna of the world. There are 12 biogeography zones and 26 biogeography provinces, which are representatives of all the major ecosystems of the world. There are 3 mega centers and 26 microcenters of endemism. Miller-Meyer says India is remarkable in both species richness and endemism, although it ranks 10th in position. The large species richness and abundance are due to immense variety of climatic and altitudinal conditions in country. These conditions vary from the humid tropical Western Ghats to the hot deserts of Rajasthan, from cold desert of Ladakh and the icy mountain of Himalayas to the warm coast of peninsular India, and these include ecosystem diversity that is the highest in the world, which represents forest ecosystem, grassland ecosystem, wetland ecosystem, coastal and marine ecosystem, and the desert ecosystems. India has been divided into 12 biogeographic regions: Trans-Himalaya, West Himalaya, Eastern Himalaya, Northeast India, the Indian desert, semi-arid zone, Gangetic plain, Western Ghats, Deccan Peninsula, Indian coasts, Andaman and Nicobar Island, and Lakshadweep Island. Dear friends, let's now talk about the hotspots. The term hotspot was introduced by Mayer in 1988. According to him, an area is designated as a hotspot when it contains at least 0.5% of plant species as endemics. The hotspots are the richest and the most threatened reservoir of plant and animal life on Earth. The key criteria for determining of hotspot are number of endemic species, that is the species which are found nowhere else, and degree of threat, which is measured in terms of habitat loss. There are 34 such hotspots of biodiversity on a global level, out of which 2 are present in India, namely the Eastern Himalayas and the Western Ghats. These hotspots covering less than 2% of the world's land area and are found to have about 50% of the terrestrial biodiversity. Dear students, remember that India has 2 hotspots. These are Eastern Himalayas and Western Ghats. We will study them for understanding the diversity present in these 2 hotspots and also the species that are endemic to these areas. Eastern Himalayan hotspot, also called as Indo-Burma hotspot. In the whole of Eastern Himalaya, there are an estimated 9,000 plant species with 3,500, that is 39% of them being endemic. In India's sector of the area, there occur some 5,800 plant species, roughly 2,000, that is 36% of them being endemic. At least 55 flowering plants endemic to this area are recognized as rare. For example, the pitcher plant, Nepenthes khasiana. The area has long been recognized as a rich center of primitive flowering plants, and the area is recognized as cradle of speciation. As regards faunal diversity, 63% of the genera of land mammals in India are known from this area. The area is also a rich center of avian diversity. More than 60% of Indian birds are recorded in the northeast. Indo-Burma is one of the most threatened biodiversity hotspots due to the rate of resource exploitation and the habitat loss. The second hotspot of India is Western Ghats. Western Ghats is a region considered as one of the most important biogeographic zones of India, as it is one of the richest centers of endemism. Due to varied topography and microclimate regimes, some areas within the region are considered to be active zones of speciation. About 1500 endemic species of dicotyledon plants are reported from the Western Ghats. 245 species of orchids belong to 75 genera are found here, of which 112 species in 10 genera are endemic to this region. Nearly 235 species of endemic flowering plants are considered endangered. As regards the fauna, as many as 315 species of vertebrates belonging to 22 genera are endemic. These include 12 species of mammals, 13 species of birds, 89 species of reptiles, 87 species of amphibians, and 104 species of fish. The extent of endemism is high in amphibian and reptiles. There occur 117 species of amphibians in the region, of which 89 species, that is 76%, are endemic. Of the 165 species of reptiles found in Western Ghats, 88 are endemic. Many of the endemic and other species are listed as threatened and include loin-tailed macaque, Nilgiri langur, Nilgiri tahar, flying squirrel, and Malabar grey hornbill. Now friends, we will recognize the importance, or we can say the value of biodiversity. The value of biodiversity is immense. Biodiversity in terms of its commercial, ecological services, social and aesthetic value has enormous importance. We are benefited by other organisms in innumerable ways. Sometimes we come to know and do appreciate the value of organism only after its loss from this earth. Very small, insignificant, useless looking organism may play a crucial role in the ecological balance of the ecosystem, or may be potential source of some invaluable drug for dreaded disease like cancer or AIDS. Even today, biodiversity remains vital, and as much as 67% to 70% of modern medicines are derived from natural products. In developing countries, a large majority of the people rely on traditional medicines for their primary health care, most of which involve the use of plant extracts. In India, almost 95% of the prescriptions are plant-based in the traditional systems of Unani, Ayurveda and Siddha. Many indigenous medicines also utilize animals and their parts or extracts as remedies for various diseases. Diverse habitats and species also have non-consumptive use value. The indirect use of biodiversity includes ecosystem process of biological diversity, which provides valuable ecological services to the biosphere. Some examples are the ecosystem's ability to absorb pollution, maintain soil fertility and microclimates, recharge groundwater and provide their invaluable services. Many industries are dependent upon productive use values of biodiversity. Students, we have to protect our biodiversity, which are facing various threats. These threats include deforestation and overgrazing, habitat destruction and fragmentation of the area, including mining and quarrying activities, conversion of rich biodiversity site for human settlement and industrial development and destruction of coastal areas, poaching and hunting for flesh, fur, skin, horn, nail and recreation, forest fires including anthropogenic causes, overexploitation of the resources for commercial gain, natural calamities like floods, high wind velocities, earthquakes, etc. Environmental pollution and release of toxic substances, soil erosion and loss of soil nutrients, population pressure and unequal distribution of resources, agricultural expansion, spreading urbanization and establishment of industries, construction of hydroelectric power projects, possible global climate change like depletion of ozone layer, global warming, etc. Growing demands, unplanned development, introduction of invasive species, lack of awareness, loss of traditional knowledge, nature of legal system, filling up of wetlands and uncontrolled commercial exploitation. Friends, thus there arises a need for conservation of our rich biodiversity. India's rich biological diversity is rapidly eroding. At least 10% of India's recorded flora and possibly a large fraction of its wild fauna are threatened, with many on the verge of extinction. In the last few decades, India has lost at least 50% of its forests, polluted over 70% of water bodies, built or cultivated encroached upon its grasslands and degraded many coastal areas. Every country has the responsibility to conserve, restore and sustainably use the biological diversity within its jurisdiction. Biodiversity is essential for maintaining the ecological functions, including stabilizing of the water cycle, maintenance and replenishment of soil fertility, pollination, cross-fertilization of crops and other vegetation, protection against soil erosion and stability of food producing and other ecosystems. Conservation of biological diversity leads to conservation of essential ecological diversity to preserve the continuity of food chains. International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources (IUCN) and World Wildlife Fund for Nature (WWF) are among the leading international organizations concerned with biodiversity conservation. Biodiversity at all levels can be best preserved in situ by setting aside an adequate representation of wilderness as protected areas. Now, what conservation measures could be taken to conserve our biodiversity? The steps that could be taken as conservation measures include maintenance of the integrity of the habitat and improvement of habitat in productivity and quality for the desired species to grow and reproduce well. Prevention and control of forest fires. Burning of grasslands has to be controlled. By controlling the forest fire, protection can be given to wildlife. Excessive cutting should be eliminated and only mature trees should be harvested. New seedlings should replace the harvested trees. Fragmentation of the forest area or wildlife habitat, which decreases the biological diversity, both genetic diversity and ecological diversity, should be minimized. Reforestation in degraded forests and agricultural wastelands with suitable strains of tree species which are viable, genetically superior and disease resistant. Establishment and maintenance of germplasm banks of wild species for future genetic improvement and breeding programs. Conservation of endangered and endemic species in natural forests, which are the guardians of diversity, should be given prime importance. Sensible and wise use of forest products and the public awareness about the importance of forest wealth to mankind and ecosystem can promote the conservation. Efforts should be intensified to curb the destructive activities of poachers. Establishment of national parks, national sanctuaries and biosphere reserves are excellent areas for the reservation of natural biotic communities. There are two basic strategies of biodiversity conservation: in situ and ex situ. In situ conservation involves conserving a species in its own environment, declaring forests and wilderness as protected area, setting up of national park and wildlife sanctuaries. Ex situ conservation strategies include conserving the species outside its natural habitat, captive breeding of animals in zoological parks, botanical gardens and gene banks. Implementation of educational program to promote the knowledge of conservation and preservation of wildlife, including flora and fauna, should be done through literature, scientific exhibitions, audiovisual aids and conferences stressing upon environmental conservation. The Ministry of Environment and Forest has enacted the Biological Diversity Act 2002 under the nation's Convention on Biological Diversity signed at Rio de Janeiro on the 5th day of June 1992, of which India is also a party. As per the provision of Act, certain areas which are rich in biodiversity and encompasses unique and representative ecosystems are identified and designated as biosphere reserves to facilitate its conservation. All restrictions applicable to protected areas like national park and sanctuaries are also applicable to these reserves. This act is to provide for the conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the use of biological resource, knowledge, and for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. Although India is a signatory to international conventions like Convention of International Trade on Endangered Species and Convention of Migratory Species, aiming at conserving biodiversity, still there are some problems with respect to conservation of biodiversity. Major problems with biodiversity conservation are low priority for conservation of living natural resources, exploitation of living natural resources for monetary gain, value and knowledge about the species and ecosystem inadequately known, unplanned urbanization and uncontrolled industrialization. Now, let's conclude our topic with some important points. Biodiversity means the variety and variability of all living organisms. Biodiversity constitutes the biological wealth and is studied at three levels: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. India is one of the 17 mega diversity nations in the world, commanding 7% of the world's biodiversity. Out of the total 34 biodiversity hotspots in the world, India possesses two, one in the northeast region and one in the western Ghats. Biodiversity in terms of commercial utility, ecological service, social and aesthetic value has enormous importance. Conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity is fundamental to ecologically sustainable development. Every country has the responsibility to conserve, restore and sustainably use the biological diversity within its jurisdiction, as every country is characterized by its own biodiversity depending mainly on its climate. Dear friends, hope you have understood the biodiversity of India. Thank you.